Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to the people that are hearing us all across the American continent. Good afternoon to the people that are in Europe, just like me. Welcome to this webinar. Also welcome if you're hearing us at a later stage after you have downloaded the recordings. The webinar of today is Operational Experience in Chile, Lessons Learned for Emerging Markets in Latin America. My name is Marcel Langone and I'm Project Manager at Solarplaza. Brief agenda for today. First, a short introduction on our webinar and on our panelists. Shortly after, Nicolás Rossel from EDF Renewable Services will go in depth into the interactions with authorities and grid operators in emerging markets, on the reflections on early to mid-stage O&M, and by last, O&M takeaways from the Chilean market. Afterwards, Sergio and Martín from Blue Tree Asset Management will address the asset management scope of works, also outsources versus in-house asset management considerations, and by last, the interaction with the grid operator on the asset management perspective. Then we will still have a few minutes for Q&A, and we will end our webinar in approximately 1 hour. Again, my name is Marcel Langone. I work with the Solar Asset Management Conferences in Latin America and Asia. My contact details are now on screen, so if you have any question or remarks regarding any of our conferences or this webinar in particular, please get in touch. For those of you that don't know us that well, we are a global information platform dedicated to solar PV. Our main business is to organize conferences and trade missions all across the globe. We have been established in 2004, 13 years ago. We have done events in plus than 90 events in plus than 30 countries worldwide. We have a network of around 60,000 solar PV professionals and growing every day. This webinar is a pre-call to our yearly conference, Solar Asset Management Latin America, which is going to be held in Santiago in just 2 weeks, 17 and 18 October. This is the only conference in LATAM that focuses on all the technical and financial topics that are relevant to the operational phase of PV assets, and we are expecting around 150 attendees from the whole industry chain, from banks, developers, assets managers, O&M service providers, among others. We will have plus than 40 expert speakers sharing their knowledge on stage, and we will have around 10 sponsors and exhibitors on the show. The main topics that we are going to discuss in the conference are renewable energy policies across LATAM, operations and asset management, data analytics, the secondary market, among others, and the companies that are involved so far in our conference are just listed on your screen. Special thanks to our sponsors, including our speakers of today, EDF, Renewable Services, and Blue Tree Asset Management. Thank you for making our content and conferences possible. For those of you that haven't registered yet and you would like to do so, we are launching a special code, Webinar 15, that you can use at our registration page. So the 10 first registrations will get a 15% discount code. Just before we start, if you have any technical issues, please use the chat box on your right. Also, make use of this chat box for questions that you can, of course, do in between the presentations. And the slides will be available afterwards. Presenting our first speaker of today, Nicolás Rossel. He's O&M Customer Account Manager at EDF Renewable Services. Nicolás is responsible for the O&M business development in Chile, as well as the broader Latin American market. And prior to his role, He headed Sunspot Services, a business consulting firm dedicated to helping international renewable energy companies land in Chile. And Nicolás, I will make you a presenter and I will share you the keyboard. So please be prepared.
Great, thanks very much, Marcel. Appreciate the introduction. Good morning to everybody from here in Santiago, Chile. I'm happy to be here. I'll just wait for my presentation to pop up on screen. Okay, let's get started. As Marcel mentioned, Nicolás Rossel, Customer Account Manager for Chile previously. I am next week moving to Mexico City to take on the role in Mexico, so happy to take on that opportunity. As we all know, there were earthquakes in Mexico in the last couple of weeks. It's been very challenging. This affected Mexico City as well as Oaxaca, Puebla. We had some people in Oaxaca, and obviously the whole country has been impacted, so our thoughts are with them. Let's get started here. Let's see. So my agenda here, the 3 points that were previously up on the screen. The idea here is to take from the experience that we've had as EDF Renewable Services in Chile for the last 2 or 3 years, as well as the industry as a whole, talk a bit about those and see how we can apply them to other emerging markets, particularly in Latin America, and with a special focus on Mexico. See if I can make this work. Sorry, folks. Just getting used to this here. Marcel, this seems to be scrolling a bit awkwardly. Could you take me back to the first slide, please? Perfect. Oh, there we go. Marcel, I'll ask you to move slides for me, please. So if we can go to the one that says EDF Renewable Services, there we go. Perfect. So just a quick bit about ourselves. EDF Renewable Services is the leading provider of third-party O&M services in the Americas. This encompasses full-service O&M, 24/7 remote monitoring from our operations and control center in San Diego, California, as well as some asset management and asset administration services. Next slide, please. Our organizational structure is like this in every country in the Americas where we're present: Canada, the US, Mexico, and Chile. We'll have an office that looks after everything that is development and generation. And EDF Renewable Services services those projects across the board with over 450 technicians. So we're currently present in these 4 countries that are listed here. Next slide, please. Just a map of where we're located. Obviously, the largest presence is in the US. We have significant solar assets in Canada. 70 megawatts of wind O&M that we look after in Oaxaca. We also provide BOP services to 300 megawatts of wind projects. And here in Chile, we have 146 megawatts of solar projects that we're looking after. Our safety record is one of the best in the industry. And as you can see here, over 1,300 solar inverters under management. Next slide, please. All right, we'll hop right into it. So the first section here is looking at interactions with grid operators and authorities. Next slide. So as I mentioned, what you see here on your right-hand side is our operations and control center in San Diego, California. We currently operate about 8 gigawatts of power from that center. When we first arrived in Chile, and I started at about mid-2015, our initial approach, like most of the large IPPs and other players who were coming in, was to operate projects from our control center out of the country. We were looking to leverage our existing infrastructure and obviously use the resources that we already had. What we found as we came in was that the Norma Técnica de Seguridad y Calidad de Servicio, the Chilean code, did not regulate the location of a control center. We spoke to various law firms, consultants, did several months of due diligence and found that there was nothing that would stop us from doing that. We set up meetings and discussions, as we know other similar companies did as well, to talk to the SEDEC in that time, which is now the CEN, el Coordinador Eléctrico Nacional. And we're told that while there was a legal vacuum, they were not going to permit companies to operate from outside of the country. All of this is to say that you may have, as you enter an emerging market, a vision of how you want to do things, and may well have an interpretation of what the existing codes or standards are. And the point here is that you're going to want to be careful because your interpretation may not be the same as the new grid operators. We've established a very good relationship with the SEDEC, the CEN here. We had these discussions. They were actually, the SEDEC SING, where we're operating in the northern grid, was open to looking at the possibility of operating from outside of the country. But after doing some analysis, we finally decided that it was going to be better for the project to work with a local partner. And we found a very good local partner who is now operating through whose control center we're operating with. So again, the key takeaway here is as you enter a new market, you're going to want to engage early, talk to the grid operator, talk to folks with experience in the market to understand what's going on and how to best approach a situation like control centers. This will be very interesting in Mexico, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So the next issue, this is more operational situations and issues that we live on a day-to-day here in Chile. Any market with large solar penetration will see things like this. Solar volatility. What are we seeing in the northern grid? Off to your top right, you can see just a screenshot from our SCADA system. This was one particular day in May at the Boleto project site. As the solar assets, the solar projects in the northern grid ramp up in the morning, we'll see frequency increases, frequency deviations. So the red line cutting across that graph is the set point for the grid here in Chile. It's at 50.2 hertz. In the morning, you can see from about 9:30 to 11, the frequency will increase. And up top there, it's a little bit hard to see, but you'll see that there's a correlating loss in production. This is an issue that not just EDFRS projects are feeling, but many of the projects in the area. Another issue, cloud variability. The bottom right is a very well-known graph from a study done a few years ago. That's a 5-megawatt project in Springerville, Arizona, that's showing at 10-second intervals how cloud variability can influence output. So you can see drops from about 3 megawatts to just below 1 megawatt in a matter of seconds. We're seeing a very similar situation in Boleto on cloudy days, of which there's not many in the Atacama Desert. We'll see drop-offs of 40 megawatts within minutes or even seconds. And obviously, for a grid operator, this presents a huge challenge. The question then is, you can see there at the bottom, how do you engage the grid operator in light of these solar threats as they see them? This is true of any new technology that's coming online. And our advice here is to, again, engage early, engage in a collaborative way, build dialogue. What we've done is go to the grid operator, set up conversations, meetings. Latin America tends to be a face-to-face place, so you have to gauge as you're going in what's the best approach. You know, is this a situation that I'm facing on my own? Is this a situation that's facing all of the other projects in the area? Is this a situation that impacts other technologies in the area? Does this require a formal treatment, or does this require a more informal face-to-face treatment? These are all of the questions, strategies, and approaches that we should be thinking about as we look at these new markets. Next slide, please. So that takes us to a poll question. What do you think will be the principal O&M issues in emerging markets in Latin America? And I'd ask Marcel to put up the options.
Yes, we're putting the poll just right now, so you can start voting. So in your opinion, what will be the main O&M issue in emerging markets? And you have transmission, solar variability, environment, which is hydrology, weather, and washing, or security. We will just wait a few seconds for people to vote, and then Nicolás, you can comment on the results.
And because emerging markets is obviously a wide scope, I would say if you wanted to narrow that down to just focus on Mexico, what do you think will be the main O&M issue in Mexico?
Perfect. Are we ready to launch the results? Okay, we will be showing them in a few seconds. And there we have. Nicolás, what is your take on the results? Does that surprise you?
No surprise. I think this holds true probably for Mexico and for most Latin American markets, right? Transmission infrastructure always is lagging a bit behind. I do agree that variability is always an issue as you come into a grid, and the environment has certainly presented some challenges here in Chile that were unexpected. So this certainly lines up with my thinking.
Perfect. Let's continue.
Keep moving then. Okay, so here I'll dive into more nitty-gritty, we'll call it maintenance activities and others. So we'll start with a reflection here on what we've seen in commissioning stages. For us, the EPC to O&M handover period is one of the most critical, as you might expect from an O&M guy. Our piece of advice again here is to involve O&M folks, your O&M team, as early as possible. Why? Because they're going to see things that others don't. I'll give you a couple of examples. MC4 connectors connect solar panels to the cabling. You'll have projects with obviously hundreds of thousands of these connectors. You'll also oftentimes have EPC contractors, dozens of EPC contractors on site who are coming from different places and who all have different responsibilities and different milestones. What did we see, for example? Panels that were placed, that were mounted before trenches were dug for cabling. Those panels were left out in the sun with the MC4 connectors there awaiting connection. They ultimately were not covered, and as the cables were dug, they were liable to be filled with dust. So what's an operations person going to tell you? They're going to see that, understand the project in terms of how the operation may be impacted in the future, and ask that those MC4 connectors are covered so they don't get filled with dust. What else? Again, point to multiple contractors on site, oftentimes coming from different countries, with equipment and components that are procured from all over the world. And oftentimes these will come in with signage, with labeling from other countries in different languages. Your operations folks are going to be able to see that and early on point to the local code and say, hey, these are the labeling requirements for this country. Let's start thinking about this before we get to any kind of inspection stage. Second bullet there with project documentation, I think, is one of the most critical areas as well. This is particularly true if your EPC provider is providing early stage O&M services. Oftentimes, I think there's the assumption that because the EPC will be taking on the O&M, that they are incented to document the project properly and to have everything organized into the folders and where they should be. This is not necessarily the case, and I would actually say this is usually not the case at all. And you'll find that 1, 2, 3, 5 years down the road, when you're making a warranty claim, when you're having an issue with a specific component, when anything is happening, you won't necessarily be able to find that document, and that can be critical later on in the project lifecycle. And then to hammer this all home, I think what we've found great success with as an O&M provider, is to push to have asset management, EPC, and O&M sit around the table early and often. Incentives are not always aligned. This can be with third parties or even within in-house. And it's important to have these conversations happen as early as possible. To the right, you'll see a PV turnover checklist. That's one of the documents that we use whenever we come on any site. Next slide, please.
We have another
question is before the next section, and the question here is, who do you think is better able to make a decision on when to wash panels? Your operations manager or your asset manager?
Okay, please begin to vote, and we will comment on the results just after a few seconds. Okay, we are ready to see the results. Nicolás?
That's interesting. I think that is certainly at first glance what you would expect. But if we can dive into the slides, I'll explain why I think that's not necessarily always true. Perfect. So there's always been a lot of talk about panel washing here in Chile since I've entered the market here. I think that what I've tried to do here is to capture some of the other elements, the ones that aren't so Chile specific and that don't drill down into specifics, where the project is located and things like that, and take a bit of a higher level view that we can apply to other markets. So in entering another market, I think it's important to look at washing economics. What are the realities of the market that you're entering? Are you operating with subsidies, or is this a free market like Chile where it's full-on competition? Does your project have a PPA, or is it selling into the spot market? And then this leads to the question of asset management or O&M. Obviously, your operations manager is going to have the day-to-day know-how. He's going to understand if the mining site nearby is doing some sort of work that is kicking up dust that's coming over. He's going to have a better sense of the weather patterns, and if the wash that you have scheduled for the next week is going to be totally offset by some sort of weather pattern that's coming in over the next couple of weeks. And he should have a better handle on that. However, your asset manager is going to be better positioned to make an economic argument for when to wash or not, depending on the financial realities of the project. So I think, like everything, the answer isn't clear, and it has to do with good communication between asset management and O&M. I'll touch on a couple of points quickly because time is moving fast. In entering a new market, it's going to be important to think about where you are and understand that not all technologies and services are going to be available, particularly on remote project sites. So we're in the middle of the Atacama Desert. There are, several dozen projects in Chile, and what we've seen, for all the talk about robots and tractors, the reality in Chile is that of all the projects, I know of one site that is using robots, a couple that are using that are using tractors, and the vast majority of which are washing manually. How you wash is going to be largely dictated by the services that are available, and this is worth thinking about before you enter the market. The final piece, as you start developing your project, you'll start to see nitty-gritty details that can impact how you wash. For example, the famous torque tubes. Does your project have torque tubes, and is that going to limit the technology that you can use? If there's a tube running through the middle of your rows, be assured that you will not be able to wash with the tractor. And something that we saw in our project, we have two different tracker technologies, one of which stowed at exactly flat with no tilt, and another that stowed with a slight tilt. And we found that after a rain, which doesn't happen often, again in the Atacama, the panels with a slight tilt were able to drain that water and essentially got a free wash, whereas the panels that were stowed with no tilt had the water pool on them, and the next day as it dried, there was no difference between how the panels had been the day before. So these little things you'll find over time on site. Next slide, please. Quick reflection here on a few other key critical points. Obviously, safety is the most important element of operations and maintenance. We certainly take that view and have many systems in place in order to ensure the safety of our technicians. I think it's worth mentioning that special care should be taken in new markets because as simple as solar technology may seem, there is an experience. You'll have technicians who are not used to working with this, and there's a new set of challenges to work with. So extra focus has to be placed on safety when entering a new market. CMMS capabilities, off to your right, this is a picture I took last week on our project. Well, we were implementing a new tablet, a mobile app for our technicians to use. You'd be amazed the number of solar projects around the world that are run on Excel. I think in the year 2017, this is not the approach that you want to take for your new project, particularly in a new market that has other risks. You're going to need to model the project as early as possible, input it into a CMMS, and capture data early. That first stage in getting the project off to a good start is critical for the continued success of the project over time. And in the same vein, managing your supply chain, having a warranty claim process set up prior to getting started is critical. The infant mortality stage that we call the first 2 years of the project, things will break. Things will stop working. And if you're on a site that has procurement or supply chain difficulties and there's a 4 to 6 month lead time on a part, you can lose significant production. So having this set up and functioning properly in a new market on a remote project site is going to be absolutely essential. And if we can move forward, the last slide, I have one last slide that summarizes some of these key takeaways. Just jump right into them. So here we go. What are the final takeaways that I can share with you folks from the Chilean market as applied to new emerging markets? I've broken them up into different stages here. In the development stage, involve O&M early and often. Define proper technology. Have a look at your EPC RFPs. Make sure that you have the technology in there that's forward-looking and not backwards-looking, right? Markets will change, grid operators will change their requirements, and retrofits are expensive. So if you're thinking 2, 3, 5 years ahead, you're going to be better off than saying, well, the market is here today. Think about where it will be tomorrow. And finally here, look and understand the operational impact of your geography, what we talked about, cloud variability, washing security, and others. In the commissioning stage, you want to ensure proper documentation and communications between asset management, EPC, and O&M. And particularly in the case of EPC run O&M for the first couple of years, consider third-party pre-COD services. These are things like operational audits, construction support, functional testing. Make sure that somebody who is aligned with the owner's long-term vision, with the owner's long-term operational vision, is on site during the commissioning stage. And finally, during those early to mid stage of O&M, engage an O&M contractor who has experience in this new market. Make sure that they or you, if you're self-operating, have a robust CMMS. And finally, make sure that your supply chain and warranty claim management processes are in place. That's everything I have for you. I'm a couple of minutes over. So if you go ahead to the next slide, you see here's my contact information. As I mentioned, I'll be moving to Mexico at the beginning of next week, but this is one of my favorite things to talk about. So if you have any follow-up questions after this, please feel free to ask or to reach out anytime. I would suggest email because My phone will be changing soon. Off to the right, you'll see a picture of one of our O&M teams at the Bolero project site. This was taken last week, and we wish these guys great success as they kick off their project. Thanks very much, Marcel.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nicolás, for your insights. Before we continue, let's take on a first question, and then I will ask you to stay on the line. So we have a first question. What is the difference between the EPC provided O&M and third-party O&M?
Sure thing. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, EDF Renewable Services is the largest third-party O&M provider in the Americas. What this means is that we operate EDF projects, obviously, but most of our project base, about 75%, is with third parties. Why is this significant, or what's different from EPC provided O&M is mostly the alignment of incentives. So what'll happen with EPC provided O&M is that ultimately an EPC company, which is structured to build projects and move on to the next ones, will take over the first 2 years in order to maintain a certain warranty or to guarantee a certain production to the project owner. It's not in their best interest to necessarily tell the owner what's wrong with the project. If they see something that may last a couple of years, but that does not need to be taken care of in the first couple of years, they'll oftentimes cover it up or not prioritize in the way that an owner would, or that a third-party O&M contractor would. A third-party contractor is always going to have the owner's best interest in mind, because the earlier that he can spot a problem and bring it to the attention of an owner, the better off he is. And as a final point here, I'd also note that a third-party contractor like EDF Renewable Services is built to provide O&M services. That's our core mission as a company, is to provide a great O&M to EDF assets and to third-party assets. EPC businesses are great at building projects, but they don't necessarily have the safety systems, the infrastructure, or the support departments to provide great O&M. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, perfect. Nicolás, please stay on the line for later some Q&As. For now, we will continue with our next speaker, Sergio San Martín. He's the country manager in Chile from Blue Tree Asset Management. He's responsible for the South American market as well. And over the last 10 years, Sergio has been involved in a wide portfolio of renewable energy projects within the Latin American region, both in commercial and leadership positions. Sergio, please prepare yourself. I'm going to make you a presenter right now and share you the keyboards.
Okay.
Here we go.
Okay, here we go. Well, first of all, thanks, Marcel, for the presentation, and also to Solarplaza for the invitation to be a part of this webinar. And of course, to everyone who has joined in, I hope you get some insights from this presentation. And let's begin. Okay. I'm going to start first of all with a presentation of Blue Tree, about who we are, what we do, and what are we up to these days. We are a company focused on delivering asset management services to renewable assets, and we have been in business since 2009. And yeah, we basically tailor solution to our customers exclusively on the asset management, and we perform this based on 3 pillars, as you can see on the presentation. One, of course, is the commercial side of it, the technical side, and to complement the legal. Covering those 3 pillars allow us to cover pretty much all the sub-disciplines involved in the day-to-day and long-term tasks and responsibilities of an asset. And when dealing with long-term assets, it's important to have someone that can cover those tasks on the long term. A little bit more information from our side. 1 second. Oh, okay. Actually, nowadays we're managing around 366 megawatts of renewable assets, what we call the 360 degrees management, which is the concept I covered before, which is the 3 pillars: the commercial, technical, and legal. And we've been doing this in several locations. Among the more important ones are Spain, Italy, the UK, and our current expansion being taken nowadays has taken us to Chile and Uruguay. I'm based in Chile, by the way, and we are working in order to expand our presence in other markets such as the US, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and France. I think we have the first question now, right before entering our.
Yes. We have a poll question right now. Let's just put it on your screen. Okay, we have the question online. So, what is your scope of work within the solar industry value chain? Are you a developer, investor, O&M, asset manager, or other? Let's just wait for a few seconds.
Okay.
The people vote, and then we will see who do we have on the other side.
Yeah, I think the question will provide us some insight of who are we talking to, and maybe to frame the conversation towards everyone's interest.
Okay, I think we're ready to show the results. And we have many developers, also many people that are not in any of these categories.
Okay, it's an interesting mix. It has a lot of different backgrounds, so that's interesting. Okay, if we can go back to the presentation, please.
Yeah, just a few seconds before we move on.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Please go ahead.
So for the presentation, our agenda is the following. We're gonna cover basically 3 topics. The first one is the asset management scope of works, and the purpose of this topic is to start a discussion on defining the scope of works of an asset manager and its role within the organization. Also, the idea is to discuss the different interactions that the asset management has with the different stakeholders that are involved in the project. Then we're going to jump into the asset management schemes, and we're going to discuss about having an outsourced asset management versus an in-house asset management. And finally, we will cover some SAN management overview, which it's about talk about the different interactions that the asset has to have with the former SEDEC. And this topic is intended for the more international audience, since it's one of the most recurrent topics that we face when we meet with potential customers and existing ones. So let's jump into it. So in the slide, as you can see in the figure, we've tried to put the asset management in a nutshell, where you can see in the center of it, we can find the 2 primary goals of the asset management. One being to increase the profitability of the asset, and at the same time while reducing the uncertainties and risk that it's associated to its operation. And in order to do that, as we can see in the ring, in the second ring of the circle, we can see a bunch of tasks that cover multiple disciplines, from tax management, to bookkeeping, energy markets, monitoring and performance of the production, contract management, including the O&M, HSE, of course, and the way that it's not just about performing those tasks in our experience. It's also about equally important to keep a standard level of service throughout the whole life of the asset, of the life cycle, and that presents some challenges, which take us to the other ring of the figure, where nowadays you find that you have interactions with different stakeholders, that includes contractor investors that come from different nationalities. They have different experiences, different interests towards the project, and of course that also come with different backgrounds in terms of technology. So I like to use the term of a global asset manager that sort of understand all those interactions and all those differences, and kind of develops tailor-made solution to the particular interest and backgrounds of the customers, or which in the end are often are the investors and owners of the plants. So now we're jumping into our second topic of the day, which is the outsourced versus the in-house asset management. And I believe we have the second poll here.
Yes, we do have the second poll question right now. Let's just jump into it to introduce the topic. In your opinion, what is the most ideal model of asset management for your organization or company? Is it in-house, outsourced, or somewhere in between? Let's just wait for a few seconds and then comment on the results.
Great.
Okay, I think we are ready to show the results. No surprises here, right, Sergio?
Yeah, no surprises. I think when you have black and white, people will always go for the gray option with good reasons, of course.
Let's go back to the presentation.
Okay.
And let's see what is the rationale behind that.
Yeah, what you can see here on the slide is just a basic matrix. We have split the decision into three main topics, which is the cost, of course, the know-how on the company, and the time of implementation. And we understand that different assets or asset owners do have different interest in terms of the contingency of the project. So they give different importance to those three categories. So basically, what we've found out talking to customers and potential customers and people from the industry is that, and from our experience, of course, is that cost-wise, the ideal scheme is to outsource it as you have a small to mid-sized project portfolios, especially when a medium-sized IPP, for example, has limited number of projects in different locations with different regulations. It's not sustainable financially for them to build and set up a team from scratch in each of the countries that they have, maybe with different set of technologies. Quite the contrary is when you go to a larger RPP or utility company that has massive projects, maybe concentrated in a few regions, but due to the volume of their portfolio, it's more than reasonable to think about building a team for their own, and that leads us to the next category, which is the know-how. Of course, when you build a team inside your organization, that knowledge takes a longer time to develop, but when it's developed, it becomes a long-term asset for your company and becomes actually a part of the core competences. On the downside, and what goes in favor of the outsourcing the asset management is that experience you acquire it right away, and you can actually also accelerate the knowledge transfer, especially when you're dealing with importing that knowledge from an already developed market into an emerging one. So I think in terms of the know-how for the company, it's gonna depend on which are your interests in terms of acquiring that knowledge and how to retain it, and the time frame, of course, which lead us to the third category, which the outsourcing of the asset management. It's of course a more faster solution. The setting up time is short and not as painless as painful maybe as developing a team from scratch. That means hiring people, allocating the right amount of resources, and beyond the time constraint of building a team, there are much risk involved in building one in terms of recruitment and development. So I would say that for this particular process, the planning it's key in order to be successful. Of course, these three variables, as the first one, will depend on the profile of the investor and the size of their portfolio. So talking about our experience here in Chile and in South America and Latin overall, we've seen that the market is tending to make asset pools show this in-between scheme where they have one or two responsible on the company side, that their mission is to coordinate overall with the asset management, but also to retain key knowledge and information regarding the project that will ensure that there's some line of continuity within the asset administration through time. So I think that's the direction that the market is going, and yeah, I think that's it for this topic, and we are going to jump to the next one. The next one, it's about the formerly known SEDEC coordination and overview, and I'm going to start with a small overview of the electrical market here in Chile, and especially on the installed capacity of the renewables. As you can see, the penetration in the last years has been more than I believe anyone expected. Solar and wind, is no surprise, are the most competitive ones, have been the most successful in the north grid and in the central one. But what I want to show actually with this slide, it's located on the right side graph. As you can see, despite all the projects that have been built, and I'm talking solar and wind farms, we only have 17% of penetration of the renewables, and the 83% is conventional. So the key takeaway of this slide is that we still have a long way to go, and there's enough room for growth of the industry. And going down to the next slide, I'm mixing it with the prices and areas, and I've just chosen two substations, which is Quillota and Diego de Almagro, and the lines above show the evolution of the prices of this year, and you can see that there are dramatical differences between those two lines, and that becomes more severe when you go for Diego Almagro, one of the most crowded spots on the system. That average the last the last line covers just the hours where we have sun. So the scenario is more dramatic in terms of price. What I'm trying to show with these two last slides is that on one side we have a lot of room for potential growth, and with the other one, with the price one, I'm trying to show that the market is getting real competitive and the margins are shrinking, and that's going to be the situation, I think, for at least for the midterm. So under this scenario of tightness, let's call it that way, it's important to have someone that understands the market and makes the management of the plan as most efficient as it can be from a commercial point of view and technical, of course, and that includes all the compliance within local markets, within different disciplines. And on the last slide, there's just a summing it's just a summary of what the SEN, which is the former SEDEC, entails, and of course it has the energy part, the balances with the whole invoicing matrix, and how key is for the performance of an asset to keep an eye on the outstanding invoices, which ultimately has a huge impact on the cash inflows of the project. We've seen it a lot here in Chile in some of the projects, and it sounds quite simple, but in the end it's I think one of the key issues that projects face on day-to-day basis in terms of their financial position. And without a doubt, it has an impact on its profitability, long-term profitability and cash flow. And on the left corner on the square, I just put some things to take consideration of in terms of regulation that can have also an impact on the cash flow and profitability, such as the 62 decree, which covers firm capacity, all the restatements that come from the ingreso tarifario or transmission tolls, which not necessarily might have an impact on the profitability, but it certainly they have an impact on the cash flow and the ability to plan for those cash flows for the future. It's also key for a project. Then you have that's the stable price. The third one that affects the PMGDs is also key to keep an eye on it and how it develops, especially for the mid long term of the projects. And then you have other regulation that covers transmissions that are also key on the variable cost of the operational phase of the power plants, and that's transversal regardless of the technology that you want to operate, whether it's solar, wind, or whatever. And I think that's it from my side. Of course, if you want to go more in depth with the conversation, I would be happy to talk about it. So that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Sergio, for your insights. We still have a few minutes for Q&As, so we will just jump into that.
Okay.
First question for you, Sergio. What do you mean when you said that it's important for an asset manager, to have a global mindset, and how would that translate on better results for the investor or owner of the assets?
Yeah, like I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, nowadays when dealing with a project, you find that investors, different contractors, especially O&Ms come from these different places of the world. Also, manufacturers of components come from all these different places and cultures. So it's important to have someone that can coordinate that on an effectively manner, and dealing with those cross-cultural differences in order to obtain results. And of course, an optimization of those interactions can definitely will have an impact on the profitability of the business, as simply put, because the business is going to run smoother. And yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the next question. We have quite a few, so if we don't answer them all, we'll try to do it later. Next one is for Nicolás, and more than one person asked this. Do you recommend any strategy for vegetation control? What is your suggestion for a better control of vegetation on sites? Nicolás, can you hear us? Seems we don't have Nicolás on the line for now. Let's go back to Sergio. Of course, also with the O&M and asset management coordination, which is very important. What are your main considerations for a smooth cooperation?
Well, I think it's quite basic, but at the end, but at the same time, it can get tricky. I think it's key to have as a baseline often and good quality communication. I know that sounds easy, but it can become a hard thing to deal with, because maybe part of the team of the O&M is located on site. The responsible of the O&M maybe it's located in another country, and the asset manager is located in another country. So I think it's at least when the at the kickoff of the project, and then at more often that the space apologies and people need to sit in the same room and discuss about the project status, especially that also becomes relevant or more relevant when you are in the commissioning phase and the COD has already begun. So yeah, I think putting everyone on the same table to discuss and to share the information regarding the project, that makes a huge difference. And if you can maintain that relationship over time, it's gonna lead to successful results.
Marcel, I'm here. Apologies, I think I was on silent.
Okay, Nicolás, did you hear our question? Can you reply on that?
The weed abatement? Sure, absolutely. It's an interesting question, because certainly not an issue that we face in northern Chile, but one that we're starting to see crop up here in central Chile, and one that we obviously see a lot in the places like the US and Canada. There's no single solution. I think that it's similar to panel washing. We have different assumptions that we use depending on geographies. As an example, in the United States, what you'll see in the southeast in places like Georgia and the Carolinas is going to be very different from what you're going to see in New Mexico, California, and Arizona. This is largely going to depend on subcontractors. This is generally not something that you would do in-house, particularly for larger sites. So I would point to the comment I made about the technology and availability of that on your project site. So it's going to be important to see what service providers are available as you're analyzing the different projects. And as a final comment, it's also important to take into consideration environmental considerations and regulations on the project. I'm sure that different markets, different municipalities even, may have different restrictions on some of the weed abatement approaches. So something certainly that's worth looking into.
Thank you very much. Next question, also for you, Nicolás. Do you have any specific recommendation about trackers, manufacturers, or technologies? And with respect to O&M costs and problems observed during your experience on EDF?
A great question. Certainly have some opinions. I would suggest, if you're interested in a more in-depth conversation about trackers, to get a hold of me via email. There's a lot of products out there. I won't make mention of any specifically. I think for any technology, really bankability matters. So I would as a first kind of generic comment would point towards the bankability of providers, because this is a technology that you're going to use over the next 20 years. I would also point out that it's important to look at the different components, understand how many motors are you looking at, who's the manufacturer of the motor. Oftentimes you can't look at the tracker as a single system. You're going to want to look at the different components, identify the different critical failure points, and understand the system as a whole. And as a third comment, I would say that it's important to look at your geography. Some projects, a place like northern Chile is going to need potentially a more robust a system that can stand up to wind and sand. If you're in Canada, we have 500 megawatts of projects in Canada. You're going to be looking at snow as a different challenge, moisture in different areas. So look at the different, have a mechanically minded person look at the component and piece that together, or think about it in terms of the geography where that technology is going to be installed.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicolás. We have many technical questions. We will forward you those questions. We will still take on a last question before we round off, and this is for Blue Tree, and regarding PMGDs. In the stabilized price scheme, do you have an invoice matrix management activities?
Yeah, you have it actually functions the same way as a regular plant, with the difference that in the end the valorization of your input energy into the grid, it's valued both at the spot price, but then it's the difference between that valorization at the spot price, it's deducted from that same valorization with the stabilized price, and then on the matrix, or not on the matrix, but on the balance, you have another column which is a compensation for the stabilized price. So it's not just multiplying the energy times the stable price. You have to go through the spot price first, and then you get the adjustment on a later stage within the same balance, though. I hope I was clear enough. Otherwise, you can send an email and we'll have to expand on it.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Nicolás. We will be, of course, be able to also discuss these topics on site in Solar Asset Management LATAM, both with the Blue Tree and the EDF Renewable Services teams. Again, you also can see now on screen my contact details for any questions or remarks. I want to thank to all the audience that was present this afternoon or morning with us, for your input and participation, for all the good questions. We look forward to meeting you at Solar Asset Management Latin America in 2 weeks, or at any other of our upcoming events, either in Ivory Coast, Amsterdam, or our solar asset management conferences in Milan and San Francisco. Thank you so much again. Wishing you a great day, and look forward to see you in Santiago. Goodbye.
Thanks, Marcel. Thanks, Sergio.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, gentlemen.